Welcome to Nice and Blunt. My name is Adam Mariancho, and these are my Week 2 wide receiver rankings. There are 4 players I did not rank due to injury, most notably Puka Nacua of the Rams, who is going to go on IR, going to be out until at least Week 7 because they have a bye in Week 6, so that's not good. Marquise Brown, I don't think will play yet again in Week 2, so he's not in this video. Rome Odunze has a knee injury of his own, an MCL sprain, and he's week to week. I do not expect him on the field in this matchup. But T. Higgins, I also did not rank, and he's probably the most likely one to maybe make it back into the ranks. But I think they hold him out once again, maybe just out of caution, but that's why I did not rank him. Those are the 4 players who are not in this video. Number 1, though, we're starting at the top with Cooper Kupp at Arizona, and holy shit, he had 21 targets in week 1, and that's definitely the highest of any wide receiver. The next best guy was Tyreek Hill with 12. So yeah, you're definitely starting Cooper Kupp. And if Puka misses significant time and Kupp stays healthy, he's probably going to be on pace for another triple crown if he sees 20 fucking targets every single week. So lock him in. You are ecstatic if you drafted Cooper Kupp. Number 2, I got Tyreek Hill versus Buffalo, and he got arrested but still put up 22.5 points on Sunday. Mostly, a lot of it did come on that 80-yard touchdown, but who cares? It just speaks to his talent. It can happen any given week, and I do see a bit of a shootout here on Thursday night against the Bills. So he's a lock, that's for sure. Number 3, I have CeeDee Lamb versus New Orleans, and no, he did not score a touchdown week 1, but we expected a bit of rust for him. There was also the fact that the Cowboys led very big early on, so I'm not worried about it. It could happen again, though, against New Orleans, but I think especially with Jake Ferguson injured, he could get 15 targets in this game, and at home, the Cowboys always dominate bad opponents. Lamb will be fantastic in this one. I think he will find the end zone like he was a lot last year. Number 4, I have Amon-Ra St. Brown versus Tampa Bay, and I know last week was bad, but I think week 1 was just really about getting Jameson Williams confident and established in this offense. They really need him to step up this year if they want to win a Super Bowl. Their wide receiver depth is pretty thin, so I'm not reading into it too much. What I am reading into is the fact that they paid him $30 million per year this offseason, and there's no way they did that just to only send him 6 targets per game. So he will have a massive bounce back in week 2. I expect at least 10, 11 targets for him against Tampa Bay, and I think week 1 will be his worst game of the season. If anything, this would be probably the lowest value you could get in terms of a buy low candidate and trade target, but you're still gonna have to pay up if you want St. Brown. Watch him put up like the best game of the week after a bit of a dud last week in week 1. So definitely trust him. I'm not gonna lower him in the ranks. If anything, I'm trying to acquire him on my team. Number 5, I have A.J. Brown versus Atlanta, and his game-breaking ability was showcased by his deep touchdown in the 3rd quarter last week, and I like the Kellen Moore offense, at least how it looked in week 1. I think it will get better. There were some O-line concerns, but they looked a lot more proficient in week 1 than they did last year. The offense was very questionable in September last season, so I think it will get better, and I also think he benefits from Saquon's presence on the field. It opens things up a little bit further down the field. So trust A.J. Brown. He is a lock in the top 8 every single week. Number 6, I have Justin Jefferson versus the Niners, and I am not concerned about him only getting 6 targets in week 1. They were also leading pretty early on in that game against the Giants. They didn't really need to send him a massive workload, and that's not going to happen against the Niners. If anything, they will need to lean on him pretty heavily in order to have any chance to compete against San Francisco. So I think he's another buy low trade target, but the price will still be pretty expensive on Jefferson. But who knows? Maybe you could trade like Garrett Wilson for a guy like Jefferson or St. Brown. Number 7, I have Jamar Chase at Kansas City, and he complained about the volume, but he said himself he expected to be limited in that matchup, so I'm not panicking. I don't think that's a wise thing to do. He still caught all 6 of his targets, and while I do like the offense more if Higgins is on the field, Chase is going to be heavily targeted as they attempt to bounce back and hold up to Kansas City. But even without L'Jarius Sneed, the Chiefs are a difficult matchup for wide receiver ones because they still have Trent McDuffie. They historically know how to shut down your best receiver. So that's the reason for my slight downgrade on Chase with this ranking. He's still a must start every single week. You can never bench him, but I would temper expectations a little bit. I think he'll be a little bit on the lower end of the wide receiver one spectrum this week. But in his last 3 games, including the playoffs, he has been held to under 80 yards in each of those games, and I think that's probably what to expect in this matchup. I wouldn't expect the wide receiver one score from Chase this week. Number 8, I have Mike Evans at Detroit, and in 18 regular season games with Baker Mayfield, he has scored 15 touchdowns, so no one can ever bench Evans. I feel like he's locked into the top 12 every single week. This rank really speaks to the elite level of confidence you should have with him in your lineup, but it is worth noting that Godwin did get more targets last week. However, Evans is always more likely to score the touchdown and is more of a deep threat overall. So he's still the better fantasy receiver in Tampa, but I do love what I saw from Chris Godwin. We'll get to him in a few minutes. Number 9, I have Deebo Samuel at the Vikings, and he had an enormous role in week 1 after Aiyuk's holdout, as well as the fact that McCaffrey was not on the field. 9 targets and 8 rush attempts for Deebo is an enormous workload, and they will probably pivot to leaning more on Aiyuk at some point, but I would not expect it to happen in week 2. I think maybe week 3 or 4 is when they'll start ramping up Aiyuk a considerable amount. So the fact that McCaffrey is also very unlikely to play, it feels kind of guaranteed at this point that he does not suit up. You got to trust the volume and the talent. They will be leaning on Deebo a lot early in the season. So he's a lock in your lineup. I think he'll be top 10 for at least 4 or 5 weeks. Number 9, I have Garrett Wilson at the Tennessee Titans, and he looked phenomenal on the Jets' first touchdown drive of the game. He had like 4 for 47. However, he barely did anything after that point. He finished the game with 11 targets, 6 catches for 60 yards, and that was not great, but definitely the volume has you excited. This offense is just so narrow. He's a lock in your lineup every single week. If it's not going to Garrett Wilson, there's only Breece Hall and Allan Lazard to compete with him. So I still trust him. It is a rough matchup, though, against L'Jarius Sneed, and we'll see what happens, but I'm definitely never going to bench Garrett Wilson as long as Rodgers is the quarterback. Number 11, I have Nico Collins versus Chicago on Sunday Night Football, and he looked fantastic in week 1. Any concern regarding Diggs and Tank Dell competing with him for targets should pretty much be dismissed. Yeah, they were all kind of close to each other, but he did lead the team with 8 targets, and Stroud loves to chuck it deep. He had a 55-yard reception versus the Colts, and he looked fantastic, especially in the fourth quarter when they needed to convert most on 3rd down. He was the go-to target as well. There was an excellent catch on the sideline to seal the game. So he's a lock in your lineup every single week. I don't love this matchup against Jalen Johnson. He's an elite corner. However, I still think you just have to trust Nico no matter what and believe that Stroud will get him the ball every single matchup. So I think you can never bench Nico at this point. I really believe he is the wide receiver to own in Houston, and that makes him matchup proof. Number 12, I have Rashee Rice versus Cincinnati, and Hollywood Brown is still out. Kelsey's role was greatly diminished, at least in week 1, and Xavier Worthy only had 3 touches. Meanwhile, Rice had 9 targets, 7 catches for 103 yards, and he is a much safer floor than anyone in this offense. He's seen 9+ targets in 9 of his last 11 games with the Chiefs, and he is a lock in your lineup. He might lose a bit of value when Hollywood comes back, but even then, I think he'll probably remain top 20, and I don't think you can ever really bench Rashee Rice at this point. Number 13, I have Jaylen Waddle versus Buffalo, and he was checked for a concussion in week 1, but he stayed in the game. He caught all 5 of his targets for 109 yards, 21.8 yards per catch. Inevitably, one of those will break for a touchdown. He's got too much upside to bench, and this game could easily turn into a shootout. I think you have to start him, especially with some injury concerns regarding their 2 top running backs. Mostert is already ruled out, essentially, and it is worth noting that in 6 games versus Buffalo, in his career, he only has 1 touchdown. And in 4 of those 6 games, he also has less than 50 yards. So there is a little bit of risk here. But if you look at the 2 games in 2022, he went over 100 yards in both of those matchups. And that was the first year with Mike McDaniel. So I still really trust him. I don't worry about Jaylen Waddle at all. And I think with this shootout potential, you have to lean into his upside. And that's why I'm not worried about him putting up a dud in this game. The Bills defense is also pretty revamped. I don't think they'll shut him down. So going to start Waddle this week. I think you have to. And I think you also have to start DeVonta Smith versus Atlanta on Monday night. It's the 3rd year in a row that the Eagles are facing Kirk Cousins in week 2 on Monday Night Football, and they have averaged 29 points per game in those wins. I understand this is the Falcons, not the Vikings, but I expect Philly to hang 30, if not more, in prime time this week, and Davante is still a big part of this offense. He saw 8 targets in week 1, and there's no reason to expect that will change. Dotson was a complete non-factor, and just like Waddle, I will lean into the upside with Davante. Number 15, I have Malik Nabers at Washington, and it feels weird to rank him this high. I am low on Nabers this season. However, I think this is the perfect spot to be selling high on Nabers after this game. I'm still terrified with the proposition of trusting Daniel Jones, and even this rank does feel over optimistic just a little bit. But Washington has a truly atrocious secondary. They just gave up 4 passing touchdowns to Baker Mayfield, and they ranked last in the NFL last season against the pass. So the only time I'm going to rank him higher than this all year long is probably in their second matchup versus Washington at home in week 9. Otherwise, he's going to be outside my top 20 almost every single week, and I just don't trust this situation with the Giants and Daniel Jones. Last week, he caught 5 for 66 versus Minnesota, and he's about to get Denzel Ward, Trayvon Diggs, and Devon Witherspoon as matchups in the following 3 games. So he will fall off a cliff after this big performance, in my opinion, and I think you should enjoy it while you can and definitely start him this week. But I think you're about to witness one of his very few great, excellent games on the season, and it is worth noting that Wan'Dale Robinson led the team with 12 targets last week. Nabers had 7, and that was a bit shocking. We expected Nabers to heavily lead this team in targets, but I think that speaks to the attention he gets from opposing defenses, and when it's a bad matchup, I think he might get shut down. So try to trade him after this boom matchup. I am worried about him long term. Number 16, though, I have Chris Godwin at Detroit, and Godwin led the team with 8 targets last week. Evans had 6, and Godwin caught all 8 of his passes for 83 yards and a touchdown. The matchup is nowhere near as elite versus Detroit this week as it was against Washington, but I still really trust Godwin. The new offensive coordinator is already paying off. He already has a touchdown, and that's half the receiving touchdowns he scored all of last year. So the floor is a lot higher with Godwin every single week, and I would try to trade for him before people realize how valuable he could be this year in a contract season. At number 17 and 18, I have Tank Dell and Stefon Diggs back-to-back versus Chicago, and Tank was second on the team in targets with 7. Diggs had 6. Nico Collins had 8. So it's pretty close to each other with all 3. And while Diggs caught all 6 for 33 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 6 rushing yards, they were pretty much all checkdowns, only 5.5 yards per catch. Meanwhile, Dell nearly had a touchdown of his own, and with 3 catches for 40 yards and 2 rush attempts for another 19 yards, I think Dell is still my preferred option of the 2. Nico is the top dog, but don't be surprised if the touchdowns pivot in favor of Tank this week, and he separates himself with targets down the field as the year goes on. For now, I'll continue to rank them back to back, but I think Dell is the guy I would rather have, and if I'm trading for one, it would be Tank before his value blows up as I'm expecting. So try and go get him. If you can get rid of Nabers and get either Chris Godwin or Tank Dell, I think you're making a big upgrade on your team. Long term, I think that's the right move to make. Number 19, I have Zay Flowers versus the Raiders, and he was not efficient last week only 37 yards on 6 catches. That's 6.2 yards per reception. But he also added 14 rushing yards, but the Chiefs historically do limit number 1 wide receivers. So while I do admit I was a little too confident in my Flowers rank last week at number 17, I believe, my top 20 ranking was too high. But the Ravens leaned on him pretty much as heavily as I thought they would. He had 10 targets as well as 2 rush attempts, and that volume is likely to continue, especially if Andrews continues to look washed. So he was wide open in the end zone on the final drive, but Lamar missed him. If that pass had hit, we'd be talking about him as a clear top 20 wide receiver, and that's what I'm going to operate with in terms of my thought process here. I still think you should trust him, and he's going to see a comparable target share all season. He's also another good buy low candidate because he did not score last week. Number 20, I have DJ Moore at Houston, and he had a very difficult matchup against L'Jarius Sneed last week. And obviously, Caleb could never get going, but he still led the team in receptions. I think he'll be better this week, and I still trust him the most of any player in this offense. He might see extra volume if Rome indeed does miss the game, and that is what I'm expecting. So that's why I think he's top 20. It is worth noting that Keenan had 11 targets, DJ Moore had 8, but Keenan only had 4 catches, Moore had 5. So DJ is their alpha. I still think he's the guy you want the most in this offense. Number 21, I got Davante Adams at Baltimore, and damn, I thought he would be top 10 last week in a matchup that he has owned for the last 2 years. And he was pretty basic with only 5 catches for 59 yards. You obviously have to start him if you have him, and I'm hopeful for a bounce back because he is going to get very frustrated soon if the Raiders cannot compete. There's some garbage time versus Baltimore that is very likely to happen here. So at the very least, I do think he's going to trend in the right direction. But if he does not, if it continues to look bad and they can't win, I imagine there's going to be a lot of rumors that he gets traded. And if you did draft Adams, you're probably really hoping that that happens because there aren't that many situations that are worse than this one. So good luck to you with Adams, but I think he's already going to be a bad option in fantasy outside my top 20 in the ranks pretty consistently moving forward. Number 22, I have Brandin Aiyuk at Minnesota, and week 1 was rough as expected. In a bad matchup as he tried to shake off the rust, he was nothing special. He also dropped a touchdown in the end zone late, and that will rectify itself soon. I still prefer Deebo as of right now, but I do think Aiyuk will be ramping up pretty quickly, and next week I think they'll be on close to equal footing. This week, though, he is not in the same tier of Deebo. And by the time the month is over, I think he will be close to the wide receiver 1 by a decent margin. I think rest of season, I'd still rather have Aiyuk. So again, not a bad buy low trade candidate. I trust him to be far better moving forward. Number 23, I have Xavier Worthy versus Cincinnati. And I know he only had 3 touches in his debut, but holy shit, the speed is just so deadly. I think the league fucked up by letting him go to Kansas City, and he scored 2 touchdowns on that minimal volume. So imagine if he gets like 8 touches in this game, the sky's the limit. So I wouldn't be shocked if it happens again with him giving you 20-point value. You know they're going to get him more established in this offense as the weeks go by as well. And especially as Marquise Brown is out of the lineup, I think you have to fire up Worthy. He can score from anywhere on the field, and it feels like he's a complete nightmare to tackle every single week. So he only needs 1 touch to break the game open. Just start him and watch it pay off. He can do nothing for the entire game, and then in the fourth quarter, take a 50-yard bubble screen to the house. Number 24, I have Jayden Reed versus the Colts, and it's a massive bummer for Jordan Love to get hurt in this offense. This greatly impacts all Packers receivers, and it's pretty risky to trust any of them with Malik Willis at quarterback. But Reed looked like such an alpha on this team. I don't think you can fade him completely. He's still great after the catch, and he can also score rushing touchdowns from just about anywhere. He had a 33-yarder in week 1 on the ground, and I think he's the only one of this group who I am still considering is worth a start. He's definitely more of a flex play, but I think he's too talented to bench. I'm going to trust that Matt LaFleur figures out a way to get him the ball. So he's top 25. I think after last week, you can pretty much never bench Jayden Reed. He'd probably be top 15 if Love was available. Number 25, I have DK Metcalf at New England, and I genuinely do not trust him to show up when he faces an elite quarterback. I was right to rank him lower last week. He was even worse than wide receiver 30, and that was against Patrick Surtain, perfect example. This week he gets Christian Gonzalez, who was hurt last year, so he doesn't quite have the name recognition as of yet, but I think he's a very legit corner. I am once again genuinely concerned about this matchup for Metcalf, but it's not as bad as Surtain, and after a bad week one, they probably try to get him involved a little bit more. I don't think he will be as atrocious as last week, but it could get ugly again if Geno struggles to throw it like he did last week. I think you're not going to be happy, but I think you have to start him at 25. I think he is in your lineup, especially based on the draft capital. You kind of just have to trust his talent to pay off eventually. Number 26, I have Michael Pittman at the Packers, and Pittman wasn't fantastic in week one. He only had 4 catches for 31 yards, but he also had 8 targets in a game where Anthony Richardson barely had to throw the ball because they scored from like 60 yards out twice. So if those 2 deep touchdown passes didn't connect, he probably would have had a much better game with even more volume headed his way if those drives progressed normally. But I don't think that's going to happen that often in this offense. It's going to be a lot of like massive deep shots from Richardson with that arm talent. So he gets a bad matchup here versus Jair Alexander. I am giving him a little bit of a downgrade on Pittman against a Packers defense that also knows they really need to step up without Jordan Love in order to win the game. So I could see him getting shut down, honestly. I think there is some risk with Pittman right now, but Richardson can also connect for a 40-plus yard bomb at any time in the game. So if that goes to Pittman, not Alec Pierce or Ashton Dulin, you'll be ecstatic about him. He only needs one of those to hit to work out, but he's more of a check down option. I'm a little worried that's just never really going to happen consistently, but 8+ targets is valuable, and that's why I would still trust him as a relatively high end flex play, but I get it if you want to bench him. These next 4 players though, oh fuck, they probably scare the shit out of you after how they performed in week one. But at number 27, I think you still have to start Marvin Harrison. Last week was definitely his worst game of the year, only 1 catch for 4 yards. And in division, I expect them to get him going in what could easily turn into a shootout against the Rams. Maybe it was really just the wind that was a factor, but you have to imagine he flashes that potential soon enough. He didn't look like as fast as we expected, but he's a must start. I think based on where you drafted him, I think you just have to tough it out. I'm not going to sell low unless you can get like, I don't know, maybe Tank Dell, Chris Godwin for him. But even then, I think you might be pissed about it after a month. I think if you drafted Marvin Harrison, I would just write it out. You made this bet at the draft and got to see it play out and trust him long term. I would be worried though. Same applies with these next 3 players. Drake London comes in at number 28 at Philly, and London is someone I expected to start slow and build momentum as both the schedule and his chemistry with Cousins got better. But Cousins looked really bad in week one. That Achilles is still a factor, and a lot of that was just the Steelers' defense, but I am worried it might be even more bumpy than I anticipated coming into the year. So I ranked him far too high last week at like wide receiver 20, and he only had 2 catches for 15 yards. He was bad, but the Eagles secondary is still bad as well. It might not be as bad as last year, but it's very young and inexperienced. I think London should bounce back at least a little bit, and especially as the score gets out of hand in the second half, that defense might ease up into prevent defense, and it could bode well for London. But there's also the world where Cousins just completely blows it in prime time again, and we could see London really put up another dud, and you're fucking terrified about having him on your roster. But I still think he's in the flex conversation this week. I don't think he scores a touchdown, but I think he'll probably go over 50 yards at least, but that doesn't really sound insanely valuable. I get it if you want to bench him. There's some players I do rank outside the top 30 who I think have higher upside, and it's kind of just a respect thing with London and these next 2 players along with Harrison. Number 29, I have Chris Olave at Dallas, and Olave, on the other hand, is someone I would probably panic on a little bit more. Only 2 targets, 2 catches for 11 yards in week 1, 2.1 fantasy points in a game where New Orleans scores 47 points is not encouraging. But they led very big early on, like almost immediately they were up 17-0, and he's still clearly their best wide receiver. So I don't expect his volume to remain this bad. On one hand, they really didn't need him to win. On the other hand, Derek Carr heavily favored targeting the tight ends, and that doesn't really make sense. So I think Olave will be fine, but I don't feel good about him returning to his top 15 preseason value, because with Derek Carr at quarterback, you're always going to feel worried about Olave's fantasy upside and the touchdown not happening. So let's pray for a touchdown this week, but I don't think it happens. Against Dallas, I would not get my hopes up. That's the main reason I'm downgrading him. If it was against a normal defense, like let's say the Vikings, I'd probably have him top 20. So I'm not going to like completely jump ship, but I am not excited if I have Olave. That's for sure. And I'm also terrified if I have Amari Cooper. Oh God, at least he had 9 targets last week, but he only caught 2 for 16 yards. That was terrible. I was way too confident in him in a revenge spot last week, and that was a mistake. I apologize for that rank on Cooper. Deshaun Watson looks completely washed. He's a terrible quarterback, and the only hope is that the Cowboys defense was just so elite that that's the reason why he looked that bad. But I don't think that's the reason. I think Watson just sucks. And until they pivot to Jameis Winston, it's going to be really hard to trust Cooper on a weekly basis. Njoku is hurt though, so that does increase the target share a little bit. They will lean on Cooper a little more, but I'm not excited to start him. I get it if you just want to bench him completely. The rank on these last 4 wide receivers should probably be lower, honestly, but I don't want to completely overreact to week 1. There's still plenty of room for them to turn it around, but if they suck again in week 2, we're going to slam the panic button, and you might regret not selling them before it's too late. Good luck with these, honestly, last 5 players. Pittman through Cooper could burn you. Number 31, though, is probably the more interesting flex plays with definitely more upside than the last 5 guys I mentioned. I have Brian Thomas Jr. versus Cleveland at 31. If not for pass interference by Jalen Ramsey, then he would have caught a second touchdown for over 30 yards in addition to his 4 for 47 and 1 touchdown stat line. He could have had well over 20 fantasy points last week. So I thought he had an excellent debut in week 1. The offense disappeared in the second half, but Brian Thomas looks like their best weapon, and I don't expect Evan Ingram and Christian Kirk to stay irrelevant, but that should draw some more focus away from him on defense. So I told you he would be more valuable than Kirk straight up this year, and that already looks to be true. I think you're ecstatic if you drafted Brian Thomas, and you're also ecstatic if you drafted Jameson Williams, who this week gets Tampa Bay at home. And what an impressive week 1 from Jameson. They obviously wanted to build his confidence after a shaky first 2 years in the league. Their wide receiver depth is very thin, so they really need him to step up this year. However, St. Brown is going to see more targets than him over the course of the season moving forward. So you have to be excited about him if you drafted Jameson, but I don't expect as good of a game in week 2. He feels like a weekly flex play though with upside, and he might start cracking the top 25 if he continues to see 9 targets. That's definitely going to be the case. He'll probably be a lock in your lineup moving forward. So you got to love the speed. He's very fun to watch, and honestly, this rank kind of feels a little too low, but I'm not going to completely overreact to week 1. As I mentioned, we'll see what happens in week 2. Number 33, I have Keenan Allen at Houston, and Rome Odunze is dealing with an MCL sprain, so he likely won't play on Sunday night, which means Keenan might see another 11 targets in week 2. He didn't do much with it though in week 1. He only caught 4 for 29 yards, and part of that was just because Caleb looked that bad. But I think he probably looks a lot better pretty soon. I do trust the talent with Caleb Williams, and as long as Keenan is healthy and Rome is not, then he's a very legit flex play. I would understand starting him over Olave, London, and Cooper if you really wanted to as well. Number 34, I have George Pickens at Denver, and I'm more confident in Pickens this year if Fields is the quarterback. You'll get a lot more deep targets, and we'll see fewer checkdowns to Freiermuth and more of a focus on Pickens, but this is a bad matchup. We saw Surtain shut down DK last week, and despite some likely high volume for Pickens, I think you're going to need a touchdown for him to have any chance to go over 10 points. So I'd rather just avoid Surtain all year long in fantasy, with the exception of a handful of wide receivers that are matchup proof, and Pickens is not one of them. So downgrade him in week 2. I honestly feel like this rank might be too high at number 34. Number 35, though, I have Ladd McConkey at Carolina, and the Chargers passing game did not excite you, but no one was expecting them to do that. However, we did expect McConkey to lead the team in targets, and that is what happened. Without the touchdown, though, he would have had a pretty rough fantasy game, but you can say the same thing about Brian Thomas, and I'm very excited and encouraged with Brian Thomas myself. So Ladd will be a pretty fine flex play this season. This is pretty much exactly where I ranked him entering the year, and he's probably going to hover between wide receiver 30 and 35 all year long in my rankings. So you could do far worse. He's a good floor play, and from a safety standpoint, he will continue to put up like 8 to 10 points on a weekly basis. I trust McConkey for that floor. But number 36, I have Tyler Lockett at the Patriots, and I get it if you don't want to bench Lockett at all. He looked good. He's like an ageless wonder, basically. He's just always reliable and consistent. He's such a savvy veteran as well. And when Geno has to have that conversion on third down, it feels like Lockett is the most trustworthy receiver that they have. So I thought he would start slow coming off the leg injury. I also thought JSN would overtake him, and he proved me wrong on both of those things. Lockett is still a very safe play, and I was wrong to underestimate him last week. Number 37, I have Christian Kirk versus the Browns, and Kirk only had one catch for 30 yards last week. But if you look back to 2023, he only had one catch for 9 yards, then followed it up in week 2 with 14 targets, 11 catches for 110 yards. So maybe that happens again. They will probably lean on him a lot more moving forward, and I'm ranking Kirk potentially far too low this week, but I genuinely think Brian Thomas is a more talented receiver and a better play in fantasy all year long. Gabe Davis also looks like a legit target for Lawrence, and Ingram was pretty irrelevant last week as well. So I would think there's a reasonable bounce back, but not an elite one like we saw last year. And Kirk is much more of a low-end flex play, not a must start, but still a decent floor option if you need him. He doesn't score a lot of touchdowns, though, historically, so I don't think he's that high of a ceiling player. I prefer Brian Thomas for upside. Number 38, I have Terry McLaurin, and yikes, I was far too confident with Terry last week. I may have read into the Jahan Dotson trade a little too much. Jaden Daniels almost refused to get any of his wide receivers involved. Maybe it was the matchup, but I don't think it was that difficult against Tampa. This offense almost entirely goes through the run game, and if Daniels isn't running it himself, he's either handing it off or checking it down to the running backs. So that's why I'm worried. Terry had a decent matchup, and he only caught 2 of his 4 targets for 17 yards. Until we see him perform well, I think you have to bench him, and this is my cutoff point here. If you're getting a receiver starting with Terry and moving forward, I think you're trying to bench them at all costs unless you're super desperate and don't have good depth at the position. Number 39, I have Calvin Ridley versus the Jets, and Ridley had a brutal matchup in week 1, and it arguably gets worse in week 2 against Sauce Gardner. The game is at home, so maybe that helps Levis a little bit play better, but I'm not confident that this offense will consistently score touchdowns this season. And if Hopkins gets healthier, that should eat into Ridley's target share as well. So I'm going to continue to fade him until the matchups improve. He gets Jair in week 3, then Ramsey in week 4, followed by a bye. So I don't think Ridley has any value until at least week 6. I would try to bench him at all costs for at least a month. Good luck with that. Number 40, I have Courtland Sutton versus Pittsburgh. And on one hand, you have to be very excited with Sutton because he got 12 targets in week 1. That was tied for second among all wide receivers with Tyreek Hill, only behind Cooper Kupp. However, on the other hand, you got to be pretty concerned that he only turned that into 4 catches for 38 yards and no touchdown. This was my concern with Sutton, that even despite a big target share in this offense, it just wouldn't translate to good fantasy value. And if it's full PPR, I'd probably start him. But I think in week 2 versus Pittsburgh, Bo Nix could really struggle, and I'd rather just avoid this offense entirely if I can, until they can find their footing. He's the only Bronco I would even consider flexing in my lineup, but at number 40 in my rankings here, I'd rather just bench him for now. I don't trust him against the Steelers. Number 41, though, I have Brandin Cooks versus New Orleans, and Cooks is still the number 2 receiver in Dallas despite the hype on Jalen Tolbert. His preseason injury did not affect him, and especially with Ferguson dealing with a hyperextended knee, I would expect Cooks' touchdown upside to continue. The volume is never elite here. He's very touchdown dependent, but you could make far worse bets this week than Cooks. The touchdown might hit once again. Number 42, though, I have Demarcus Robinson at Arizona, and Puka Nacua is on IR. So Robinson is a legit pickup, going to have some starting value for a while, but Tyler Johnson actually had the better performance in Puka's absence week 1. They both had 7 targets, but I still think Robinson is more of a reliable weapon for Stafford due to their connection dating back to last year. It might just be so heavily weighted towards Kupp and Kyren Williams, however, that without a touchdown, you're not going to get any usable value here from any other starting player, with maybe the exception of Parkinson at tight end. This is risky, but it could easily pay off against a bad Arizona defense. He's a better gamble in daily than season long, but at 42, you could do far worse. I think he's a legit pickup off the waiver wire. Number 43, I have Keon Coleman at Miami, and the rookie was the number 1 target for Josh Allen in week 1, which did surprise me because Kincaid was a complete non-factor for almost the entirety of the game, and I'm not really ready to fully endorse Keon as a good play, but if you're starting any of the Bills receivers this week, it's got to be Coleman. They need him to step up. Josh Allen cannot score 2 rushing touchdowns every single week, and they're going to need this passing game to get going to have a shot at Miami on Thursday night. So Keon Coleman, not the worst play, but maybe not my favorite. Number 44, I have Wan'Dale Robinson at Washington, and pretty under the radar because it's the Giants, but Wan'Dale had 12 targets in week 1, tied for second most among all wide receivers last week. He caught 6 of them for 44 yards with an additional 14 rushing yards. So he's just a check down option, but in full PPR, who cares? He's a bit more tempting due to that volume. But the only reason I'm willing to rank him top 50 is because Washington has such a terrible secondary. I do not trust Daniel Jones enough to trust Wan'Dale long term, but there is some upside here and a relatively decent floor as well, especially if that double-digit target share continues. Take a swing in daily. It's not the worst bet you could find at a very cheap price. The matchup is fantastic. But number 45, I have Allan Lazard at the Titans, and I cannot believe I'm ranking him here, but he had 9 targets in week 1 for 6 catches, 89 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Even Tyrod Taylor connected with him for a score. He was the wide receiver 2 in scoring in week 1. You know he's Rodgers' boy, and if Mike Williams continues to barely play, then his role is not going to change. Conklin was completely irrelevant, so Lazard has this number 3 role in the offense on lock until we see otherwise. And I don't expect 2 touchdowns every week, but 9 targets is valuable. It could continue, and I might be way too low with this rank on Lazard. Rodgers has to throw it somewhere other than to Wilson and Brees, and it looks like Lazard will get decent volume every week. I think he's a legit pickup off of the wire. Number 46, I have Jordan Addison versus the Niners, and he is questionable dealing with an ankle injury. He might miss the game entirely, but we will find out. Darnold is going to need to light it up to have any chance versus the Niners, though, and Minnesota could get completely blown out, but I think they'll be competitive this week, and that means Addison could offer some upside, but with his injury, I think I'd rather pass and just trust Justin Jefferson. He feels rather boom bust in this matchup. Number 47, I have Tyler Johnson at the Cardinals, and I might be ignoring him with this ranking. He might be just as valuable as Demarcus Robinson, if not more. He had just as many targets, 7 as DeMarcus as well last week, and actually had the better stat line, but it was mainly on 1 long run after catch, and I still prefer DeMarcus Robinson if I'm picking between the two. I think Tyler Johnson is a bit too risky to bet on, but at 47, you could do worse. Number 48, I have Rashid Shaheed at Dallas, and you know what you're getting every week, boom bust option, and if he hits on the deep touchdown like he did last week, you're happy. If not, he will burn you, and how lucky do you feel versus Dallas? I do not feel that confident it hits 2 weeks in a row. Number 48, I have Christian Watson versus the Colts, and he loses a shit ton of value with Malik Willis at quarterback. He was risky to begin with, and he was definitely behind Jayden Reed in this offense last week, but he's a pretty good bet to score a touchdown. That's what happened in week 1. That's what you're praying for, and it's not the worst bet to make, but he feels just as risky as Shaheed until Love comes back on the field. It's really touchdown dependent. And if it's not Jacobs or Jayden Reed, I'm not even considering another Packers player in my lineup this feels like too big of a gamble. Number 50, I have A.D. Mitchell at Green Bay, and he nearly had a wide open 20-yard touchdown, but Richardson overthrew him in the end zone. And I don't think Downs will be back yet. But it is possible, though, that would definitely eat into his value. So Mitchell still has some upside, but unfortunately, the two deep bombs in week 1 went to Alec Pierce and Ashton Doolin. But there was some good tape on Mitchell. I liked what I saw, and I do think he will get better as the season progresses. But if you play with Anthony Richardson, you can score from anywhere on the field at any time, and that's what you're really hoping for from A.D. Mitchell. There's like 25-point upside if two of those deep shots hit next week. So I would not dismiss him. Richardson has a cannon, and that is why he is an interesting stash that I wouldn't just give up on if I drafted. Number 51 through 60, though, I'll just kind of like speed through just to mention them because you're probably wondering where I rank some of these guys. Like Diontae Johnson, I have at 51, and fuck, this team is terrible. We thought that Diontae at least had the potential to offer the Adam Thielen value from last year, but it's a much more crowded wide receiver core this season, so that doesn't look possible at this point. And it was brutal for Deontay's value to see that Leggett actually had more targets in week 1. I'm tempted to rank Leggett higher, but I want to see that happen one more time. You might end up cutting Diontae, honestly, if this offense is that atrocious. Number 52, I have JSN, and I was very disappointed to see Lockett still have a stranglehold on this number 2 job. Maybe it changes, but until we see that, you just can't trust JSN in your lineup. I kind of feel too high with this rank, honestly, but maybe week 1 did lie to us. Number 53, I have Jacoby Myers at Baltimore, and he caught all 3 of his targets for 61 yards, but I'm not encouraged it will get much better for him unless they trade away Davante Adams. Bowers was heavily involved, and this really impacts any potential value for Myers moving forward. No, thank you. Number 54, I have Gabe Davis versus the Cleveland Browns, and he had 3 targets, 3 catches for 62 yards, so basically the same as Jacoby. Not bad, but I think he gets relegated to an afterthought as Ingram and Kirk come back into the fold. They did almost nothing in week 1, and that will definitely change. I think Gabe Davis is the least valuable of the bunch. Number 55, I have Greg Dortch versus the Rams, and he actually led the Cardinals in catches in week 1, but they were all checkdowns, and inevitably Marvin Harrison will emerge, so I'll ignore Dortch. You're just praying for a touchdown, but his floor in full PPR might warrant a higher rank. Number 56, I have Josh Palmer at Carolina, and Palmer only had 4 targets in week 1, which was surprising. It was less than Quentin Johnston, but I think he'll be somewhat fine rest of the year. He also got ejected, but it happened late enough to where it's not an excuse at all. The Chargers probably lean on the run and the O-line throughout their first month especially, and we might not see him really be a factor until they really need him in that Chiefs game, week 4 and after the week 5 bye. But I'm not going to panic on Palmer. We had very low expectations to begin the season with him, and he was a bench stash for a reason. Don't drop him, but if you need the space, I understand. You can't start him, and I actually just dropped him for Colby Parkinson because I have Jake Ferguson and need a backup tight end. He could easily have the same stat line as McConkey next week, though, and he might look like the number 1 receiver pretty quickly. Number 57, I have Jerry Jeudy at Jacksonville, and he got bailed out with a touchdown, but I don't want to bet on Cleveland with anyone other than Jerome Ford. No thank you. Give me Cooper if I'm desperate enough to start a Browns receiver. Number 58, I have DeAndre Hopkins, and he played, but I'm sure he was not fully healthy. A bad matchup this week again, but he only had 1 target last week, so I'm not encouraged. It will get better as the year goes on, but until he looks healthy, you can't start him at all. Number 59, I have Khalil Shakir, who did score a touchdown in week 1. He offers some upside, but this is a difficult offense to predict beyond Josh Allen and James Cook. I'll just pass. And lastly, I have Darnell Mooney at Philly. And maybe there's some garbage time here, but I'm not expecting the Falcons to actually compete, so I will pass if I can. But that's it. These are my top 60 rankings at the wide receiver position this week, and I feel really good about the top 23. I think all the way through Xavier Worthy, I think you're really confident. Even Jayden Reed is probably still a good gamble, but that's where it gets dicey. And honestly, 24 through 30 are just players I think you have to trust based on draft capital, but it's not that ideal of a situation this week. I would definitely understand pivoting to Brian Thomas, Jameson Williams, or Keenan Allen above them if you wanted higher upside. But I think once you hit Terry at number 38, that's where you're benching these guys. The last guy I think offers a decent floor would be Christian Kirk at 37, and it gets very risky moving forward. They're more so like options in daily fantasy, not so much in season long. So that's how I envision the wide receiver position playing out. You got some excellent must-start options all the way through like Chris Godwin. Honestly, the top 16 I think are going to be fantastic this week, and it will be very interesting. We'll probably learn even more in week 2, get a lot more clarity on some of these players. But that's going to be it for this video. If you enjoyed, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. I have quarterback, tight end, and defensive rankings coming out either later tonight or early tomorrow morning. So subscribe and ring the notification bell so you don't miss out on that. My name is Adam Riancho, and thank you for watching Nice and Blunt.